Welcome to Highland Waves, a podcast coming to you from Marshbrook Studios, situated on the banks of the world-famous Margaree River in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada. At Highland Waves, we feature stories about the people, the places, and the visitors to Inverness County. I'm Pat Wall, your host. This morning my guest is Aaron Allen, Watershed Management Coordinator for the Margaree Salmon Association. Welcome to Highland Waves, Aaron.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get into our discussion about the Margaree River and the Margaree Salmon Association, I'll take a few moments here to put both in perspective for our audiences, particularly our international audiences. The Margaree River is part of the Margaree Lake Ainslie Canadian Heritage River System. It's one of only 41 of the thousands of rivers in Canada so designated. The Margaree River drains a watershed of some 120,000 hectares, including part of the Cape Breton Highlands in eastern Nova Scotia, Canada. It flows through canyons, gorges, forests, floodplains, and farmland on its journey to where it enters the Gulf of St. Lawrence at Margaree Harbour. The Margaree River is particularly renowned for its Atlantic salmon. For decades, anglers from around the world continue to come here to try their luck on the king of fish. The Margaree Salmon Association is a 42-year-old volunteer-led organization devoted to the enhancement, protection, and conservation of Atlantic salmon and trout in the Margaree watershed. Aaron, you're a relatively newcomer to the Margaree area.
Yeah, that's correct. I just moved here about two years ago.
Okay, from where?
I live just outside of, or I lived in downtown Halifax, but I am from Cole Harbour, just outside of it.
Oh, you were born and educated there.
Educated's a strong term, yeah.
Okay. What training and education qualified you for the position that you now hold with the respected Margaree Salmon Association?
It's an interesting road I took to get this position. The education I got first out of high school was culinary school, because I was a cook for years and years before turning towards conservation. And then once I realized I didn't want to cook, I started going to university for I don't know what at the time. Turned out to be a geology degree is what I finished with. Then I returned to restaurants for a while, and I started doing some volunteer work with conservation groups, mainly on the Musquodoboit River. We helped start a Trout Unlimited chapter for the Musquodoboit right before COVID happened, so it didn't last long, but that's kind of like my road into conservation was cooking school, geology, back to cooking, then into conservation volunteer work is essentially how I came to be.
It's a varied life, but life is exciting when it's varied.
Yeah, lots of things happening.
How long have you been with the Margaree Salmon Association?
I've been with them for it'll be 2 years in July.
Okay. Obviously, you're responsible for getting a lot of things done.
We're a very busy group. I was kind of thrown into it. They didn't really know I feel like they had an idea of what direction to go in, but there was many things that we could be doing, and they said, help us make what we do better. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay. Can you give us an overview and actual what you do since you've come here?
Yeah, sure. So since my coming here, I've basically been holding the hand of the Nova Scotia Salmon Association, or they've been holding my hand, trying to get together some form of like a monitoring program, scientific monitoring for the river, to essentially look at the base health of the river to see where it is, where it can go, and what we want it to be. And that's working with habitat suitability assessments. Everyone knows temperature is a really important factor for salmon. They like cold water, so we're doing a lot of monitoring and trying to invite lots of researchers to come into our watershed to help us ask the questions we don't even know we need to ask yet. Gather more information about it, so we can hopefully have more salmon in the future.
Okay. The cold water situation that you just mentioned is becoming more and more an issue for fish.
Yeah, that's right.
Particularly since climate change and increased temperatures, etc. and they're usually involved with the term cold water refuge.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand on that a little?
Sure. So cold water refuge or cold water refugia is essentially, we think of it as a place in the river where salmon would be happy to hang out. It's like consistently cool temperatures. When temperatures in the rest of the river are, let's say, above 18, 20, 22 degrees Celsius, they're going to be looking for these colder areas that are maybe, let's say, they're 16 when it's 25 in the rest of the river. They're places for salmon to escape to essentially get out of the heat and recover from the heat. They really don't do well above 20 degrees Celsius, and they're constantly looking for cooler temperatures to just recover and exist, whether it's from angling or other stressors just of migration. They like the cold water to rejuvenate.
At the moment, I think you've started a program on the central part of the river, which we know as the swimming hole. Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, sure. So the swimming hole pool itself it's a large holding pool on the northeast Margaree River, between, for people who know, between Doyle's Bridge and Cranton Crossroads Bridge, right next to the church. So that pool itself is pretty important because it has the Lake Olaw Brook that flows directly into it at the top of the pool, and it has really, really deep water, in some places as much as 18 feet deep. I know because I was snorkeling it myself to look for my temperature logger that I nearly lost. And, when we keep visiting that pool, we notice that it's holding tons and tons of fish, but at the same time, the bank is eroding beyond a small rock wall that was made years and years and years ago. So it kind of, while it's still a really good pool at this moment, if that wall starts to erode away and the river routes behind it, we would lose this really good quality cold water refugia for Atlantic salmon. So we're currently working on a project to armor rock that section that is eroding behind the old rock wall to enforce it, to essentially keep that pool where it is, and not have any adverse effects downriver.
Okay. You've had some experience, or the Margaree Salmon Association have had experience with doing major work on pools like that in the past, because I think maybe 5-6 years ago you did the pool up in the sanctuary.
Yeah, that's right.
That was a large pool that you created a berm there, not only to protect the fish, I guess, but also if it had breached, it would have been disastrous for the lower part of the river in that case.
Yeah, that's right. The berm that we built there, it has protected the pool, and I visited a few times, and it holds so many fish. It's kind of remarkable, but also it prevented having to reroute the river around that pool. Would have destroyed a road, and it's the only road in and out for a community up there and things like that. So it kind of had a lot of benefits besides the ecological benefit to the salmon itself.
Yeah. Some years ago, you did a geomorphological study as well. Did that form the basis of your management plan for the river?
Yeah, so the geomorphological assessment that we had done, I believe it was 2017. It was either 2017 or 2019 when that finished up, and we were able to review the actual results of it. And that is essentially pointing us in every direction as we go. That was a main stem assessment, so assessing the Northeast Margaree from top to bottom, and it kind of pointed out to areas where we could actually put our efforts and have meaningful
Outcomes,
yeah, thank you. Meaningful outcomes. And then there were sections of the river where they said, unless you quite literally have billions of dollars and unlimited resources, don't bother touching it, because the river knows what it wants to do at this point in time. So, it kind of gave us a direction of where to and to not put our limited amount of funding to work on the river, as well as made us realize that the work that we were already doing in the tributaries, which are the nurseries for Atlantic salmon and brook trout, was still really important work.
You touched on tributaries. The Margaree Salmon Association has been emphasizing tributaries for quite some time. Perhaps you could tell us why.
Yeah, so the tributaries, and this is mostly coming from the work from Nova Scotia Salmon Association. You know, us on land, we can't really have much effect of what goes on in the ocean. It's really difficult to police the ocean or have influence over millions of countries or that are influencing it. So the things that we can focus on were the tributaries, which are the nurseries and spawning grounds for Atlantic salmon. So just like in the main stem, as I mentioned before, they want cold, cool, clear flowing water. And, you know, things that can be of detriment to that is like silt in the water. If you get rid of a riparian zone, you might have the wrong type of substrate, like gravels need to be a certain size to spawn in and things like that. So through working with the Salmon Association, we've been installing structures and bank retainment walls and a couple of other things into these areas to make sure that the right amount and right size of gravel is being input into certain sections of the river for spawning and juvenile habitat.
Okay. It seems to me that tributaries are also a place where smaller fish can hide from predators more than they can in the open river.
Definitely. Yeah, it's definitely a good place for, I mean, there's more nooks and crannies than the smaller rivers, I think.
You've done a lot of studies on the river. Can you perhaps elaborate on some of those studies that you've been doing?
Yeah, so the work that I've been doing, focusing mostly on baseline assessment. So every few years, we're kind of blessed in the Margaree that the water chemistry of here is generally quite good. So we do something called cabin studies, which I cannot remember the acronym of right now, but it looks at water quality and as well as the microinvertebrates that are indicators of water quality in a system. So, you know, looking at the chemistry as well as what other small animals live in there gives us an idea of what the quality of the water is. But then to look at the morphological side of the tributary work, we're doing habitat suitability indices assessments. And those look at quite literally the shape of the river. You know, does it bend this way and that way at the right time? Is the depth appropriate for adults? Is there depth appropriate for juveniles in certain sections? You know, is there a riffle run pool sequences that happen as they're supposed to? So we'll go into the river and stand there with a measuring tape, essentially taking bank full width, bank depth at different areas and things like that, and plug it into a computer, and it spits out scores for us. So that's an assessment tool that we've been using for habitat suitability. On top of that, and we've been doing this for a number of years, is temperature monitoring, which we're always expanding. We partner with DFO. They have about 10 temperature loggers throughout the river, kind of spread evenly. We had probably 15 when I started in 2022, and then we were able to expand that to double it to about 30 throughout the watershed. And I think coming up this year, we'll have, in total with the ones with DFO, we'll do about almost 50 temperature loggers throughout the river to kind of get a better profile and essentially look for these cold water refugia areas to see what is more important to protect. Kind of helps target, like, okay, so this section, it has a cold water seep, an input of groundwater. The fish love to sit there, nose into the cold when it's 30 degrees outside. We'll make sure that we'll try to protect that pool, or, you know, make sure there's trees planted so it doesn't move this and that. It's kind of difficult to do all these things, but if we collect more data, well, maybe we'll get pointed in better directions.
You were talking about invertebrates, etc., a little while ago, and one of the ones that comes up is the pearl mussel. Can you talk about that a little?
I can talk about it very little. This was a study. We had a study done on eastern pearl mussels in the Margaree. I want to say 2017 or 18. Geez, it could have been 19. Anyway, before my time. But from what I think I understand is that they're an incredible indicator of water quality. In a river system, if you have eastern pearl mussels of an age class that covers wherever you have an age of a pearl mussel of a certain age, that means there was good water quality that year. So they can live to be quite old. And I think that there's one picture of all of these mussels on a log, and the expert is pointing them out and says, okay, so these ones are 100 years old, these ones are 10 years old, and you have every age in between. So we've had really high quality water for that entire time, is what that indicates. There is also, I believe I read a study, and I wouldn't quote me on this, but there might be a relationship between eastern pearl mussels and Atlantic salmon returning to the ocean. Something to do with their interaction on their gills allows them to return to the ocean. Now, this is a little bit harebrained, but I remember reading this when Greg Lovely, one of our directors, was talking to me about it a few years ago now.
Interesting. What about invasive species?
Invasive species are becoming a problem. We always talk about smallmouth bass because there was an illegal introduction of smallmouth bass into the system in Lake Ainslie, which is the biggest lake in Nova Scotia, also feeds the southwest Margaree. And, smallmouth bass have taken over the mainland. There's very few systems that are not full of smallmouth bass. They do still have a hard time in cold water. That's why they haven't really moved into the northeast Margaree yet. But we are working on invasive species monitoring. Last year, specifically for smallmouth bass, we did a targeted eDNA study where we essentially just took a scoop of water, ran it through a filter, and then sent that off to a lab to test for DNA of smallmouth bass. The only place that we found smallmouth bass was at the mouth of Lake Ainslie, which is expected, but it's kind of disheartening to get no results when you actually want no results from the rest of them, so it's kind of silly. But we're working right now on looking into another type of eDNA monitoring called meta-barcoding, where you send a sample away and they can tell you what is in the watershed with specific targets for other types of invasives. The invasive species that are not as popular, I guess, or not as well known because they're not fish. Many people are like, oh no, I caught a smallmouth bass instead of a brook trout or instead of an Atlantic salmon, but they're not really thinking of the invasive zebra mussels or the crayfish that are already in Nova Scotia and in Cape Breton. And I was reading recently that these crayfish that are now starting to invade many rivers in North America, where they shouldn't be, are changing ecosystems entirely. They are ecosystem engineers for their own good and to the detriment of many fish, such as Atlantic salmon.
Where did they come from? In ballast water from various areas?
I think their crawfish was ballast water introductions, from what I understand, but it's hard to really pinpoint at all.
Okay. The Margaree is a heritage river, and over the last few years, there's been a lot of activity on the river in terms of recreational activities. Paddleboarding, rafting, tubing, kayaking, and all of those sorts of things, along with angling.
Right.
Has there been any conflict amongst those groups?
I can only imagine that there is. I haven't heard anything directed to MSA about this in particular, but I've been out fishing with anglers who, we see a canoe or a kayak coming, and like, oh no, they're going to ruin the fishing for us or whatever, something like this. And I don't think they are. I think that, they're kind, they just pass behind you when you're fishing and whatnot. It's totally fine. But I think that, the way that the industry of tubing and paddleboarding and kayaking and all this stuff is growing, like, these are more people that are going to love the river. The more people that love the river, I think that the better it is to convince people how important it is to save. And who knows, maybe we can get some more money to help do that.
We can harness it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I've seen lots of activity while I've been fishing on the river. And I must say, all of the participants have been quite willing to move, or I will move.
Right.
The other thing is, most of those activities outside of the angling part take place when angling is not really a high priority, like early in the morning and late in the evening are usually when the anglers are mostly on the river.
Right.
And these people are usually up, they sleep in at 9 o'clock and then they go do their thing.
The crack of noon or so, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, so.
Yeah, and then also the high water times when people are doing the most paddling, like that's April, May before salmon season, so another example.
The Margaree Salmon Association provides a lot of public information. Perhaps you can tell us, how you provide that and what form you provide it in.
Sure. Yeah. So, all of our activities, we have our website, which is actually pretty good. Lots of information on there, and through that website, you can get to our newsletter, which we also publish in paper form if you're interested and want a copy of that. So Facebook, our website, our newsletter. We find ourselves often writing to the Oren to let people know what we're doing, as well as our regular grant reports to people like the Salmon Association and stuff like that. That would all be public information as well.
I noticed that you provide benches along the river at places, and I think there is an initiative now to provide landing nets at some particular pools.
Mm-hmm.
You provide maps for the river maps, so people can find their way around the river.
Right. We do all that stuff as well. You know better than I do. I wasn't thinking.
And you do have etiquette pamphlets as well, so people can address the issues we were just talking about, and how to fish properly on the river so everybody can enjoy it.
Right, exactly.
And I also notice you're encouraging the use of the iNaturalist app.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's iNaturalist, for people that don't know, is a citizen science app where people with your phone can go around the world, take pictures of flora and fauna, and upload it to essentially a world database of flora and fauna, I guess. So we have, in 2021, I believe, my predecessor, they started doing iNaturalist BioBlitz, which is just gathering a whole bunch of people together to go out into the woods and the river and take pictures and upload it to iNaturalist. And it's just another tool in the shed to show what species are in the watershed. Who knows, you might find an invasive species or an endangered species, both of which could trigger either action or protections of some sort.
I just noticed a snippet of information where observers in the Margaree watershed have documented over 15% of all the iNaturalist reports in Cape Breton.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. Yeah. It's Margaree is so full of trails, and it's so beautiful that we bring a lot of people here. So it makes sense to me that we do a lot of it here.
You do a lot, and in order to do that, it costs money.
Yes, it does.
So how do you fund all of those projects that you're involved with?
I do a lot of grant writing in the fall after our field season wraps up. So the Margaree Salmon Association is very lucky for a nonprofit. We have some money in the bank that was gifted to us when someone passed years ago, and off of that money we're able to make a little bit more money for our bigger projects. So that money is doing work for us to continue, paying people like me to have a job. And on top of that, in order for specific projects, we work with many grant folks like the Salmon Association, the Federation for Conservation of Atlantic Salmon. They're one of our main grants that we apply for. And there's many other community grants that we started looking into this year. I think all told, we've applied for almost $200,000 worth of grants for this 1 year, to pay our employees to do the restoration work, as well as help out with research and things like that. It's not just grants, but, we're partnering with a researcher at Dalhousie who's helping give us some money to help him do some work.
Sure.
So in-kind contributions, things like that.
You say your field staff. How many field staff do you have?
We have 4 people on we call them the work crew, and then we'll have 2 field technicians joining me this summer. So 7 people, including myself.
And you work with other conservation organizations as well. You did mention one, the Nova Scotia Salmon Association. What other ones do you work with?
Right, so we work closely with the Cheticamp River Salmon Association and the Inverness South Anglers Association, with neighboring large rivers on either side of Margaree. Our organizations are all pretty small, so, it makes sense for the 3 of us to buy one electrofisher because we don't need it every day, so that's, $20,000 we can all save by sharing equipment as well as know-how. So I think between the 3 watersheds, we were all trained and certified to do certain things, and we share equipment that way. We're also working closely with DFO. We're helping support them this year, as well as inland fisheries with the hatchery that they have in Margaree. Atlantic Salmon Federation is another contributor to us. I'm blanking out a whole lot, but there's so many names. Like the list of names that I have to put at the end of my presentations, I always forget one, and it's like probably 15 or 16 groups long. ACAP Cape Breton is another big one.
Yes.
The Salmon Museum is one. Lots of nonprofits in the area that are willing to help the river out.
That's great. It's one of the big organizations, sort of the global organization in conservation, is the Atlantic Salmon Federation.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have direct input into what you do, or are they an advisor, or how do they operate with the Margaree Salmon Association?
Right, so they are, the Nova Scotia Salmon Association is an affiliate of the Atlantic Salmon Federation, so it's starting to work like a trickle down, like, NSSA is the affiliate for Nova Scotia, and then we hear from them. That's the way things have worked. But Atlantic Salmon Federation is getting more involved in things on the island through their Wild Salmon Watersheds program that is just starting up. But we're going to see what that looks like as we develop it.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap up?
I have the best job in the world. That's probably the only thing I could say about my position. I kind of fumble to come up with words to say how good it is, but I live in what I think is the most beautiful place in the world, and protecting a river that I fell in love with years before I started this work. That's all I can say about the Margaree.
Well, that's wonderful. And thank you for coming to inform our listeners about the Margaree River and what the Margaree Salmon Association is doing to address the many challenges presented by nature. As you indicated, the challenges are many and varied in this ever-changing environment, but you seem to meet and address them very well. I wish the MSA every success as it progresses with these endeavors on behalf of us all. And it's time to remind our listeners that on the management side, the heavy lifting is done by a volunteer board of directors who work well and do an excellent job. Funding for the Margaree Salmon Association is always a challenge, and financial help is always welcome. Donations can be made by going to the Margaree Salmon Association website at www.margareesalmon.ca and just click on the yellow donate button. Thank you to our listeners, and a reminder to hit the like and subscribe button so you can stay up to date. Remember, subscribing to Highland Waves is free. Our thought for today: the earth is always changing, readjusting to our existence and our demands. So long for now, Pat.